Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and hey, it's a Lancer video. It's been a little bit, but that's because we've been so busy with a lot of other things here on the channel, and that's probably going to continue. I think next week I'm also getting another book from Paizo. I'm getting a book like every month from Paizo. So the Lancer videos are going to be on a little bit of a slower time basis from moving forward, but I will try to get them out as soon as we can. We also just had a really big community event around Lancer. So if you want to be a part of any future community events, check out the description where there's a link to the Discord where, we hold all those kind of events. But let's go ahead and get to today's video. Today we're talking about the Swallowtail. So the Swallowtail is a very interesting mech. It's a support frame, and it's very interesting because there's not many pure support frames in the game. There might not even be another one besides maybe the Ranger variant and the Lancaster. A lot of other mechs kind of have a something else. Support typically and like defense or something. The Swallowtail, I would say, probably even is more of a support slash artillery, because the thing is in the description you can see here, it's supposed to be a long range scouting mech, but a long range mech nonetheless with fire support. So I don't know. I like this mech though, and I think it offers a lot of really cool things that you can add to your build. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so starting off with the stats. So overall, nothing too interesting besides the fact that it has a 20 in its sensors. And it does have a higher than average evasion and E defense at 10 each, making this a pretty easy mech if you want to bolster some of your defenses without needing to rely on your armor. It also does not have a lot of HP, meaning this is a very squishy mech. It's not designed to be taking fire really at all, and whatever playstyle you want to go with, you're probably going to need to take precaution against artillery mechs or any artillery, I guess, enemies that you come across, as that's one of the biggest weaknesses of this mech. Normally, it tries to stay super far out of range, so it's not at risk of getting hit. But when it comes to artillery fire, I mean, range is not necessarily that big of an issue. Another interesting thing to make mention of is its speed is actually pretty high. Agility does not look like a really bad investment when it comes to the Swallowtail. But some of the more interesting parts of the Swallowtail obviously are going to be its traits. So its traits, integrated cloak is very interesting, though it's very much a double-edged sword, because at any turn that you end and you have not yet, or any turn that you end and you have not moved, you become invisible until the start of your next turn. Now, if anything causes it to move or take a reaction, it loses this invisibility, but otherwise, this very much plays into its core playstyle design, which is sit far away and scout the enemies, doing a bunch of lock-on stuff, and maybe firing and then ending your turn and then waiting. Hopefully, no enemies find you. And in fact, when I said scanning, that's because its prophetic scanners is probably the most powerful trait in the game. It's so strong because it's handy against so many different types of enemies, and oftentimes some of the most annoying enemies to deal with. Its prophetic scanners once per round, when you inflict lock-on a target, the target becomes shredded until the end of its next turn. Now, this is a potential problem if you're playing with a GM who is wary of this particular thing, because then the enemy can just immediately go next, which is kind of a douchey move. And so you want to do this on enemies that have not gone already, which means that the Swallowtail honestly wants to go later in the initiative than other mechs, just so that its prophetic scanners can't necessarily be wasted. But simultaneously, you can't go last, because then in the next round, that same enemy could move. So you need to go somewhere in the middle so that you can hit enemies that have already went and use this effect. Now, Shredded is really good because it obviously it removes armor and resistances. So this is a really good way to deal with some of the bulkier, scarier enemies in the game, or just the enemies that are longer for your team to take out. And it's just a quick action to do, which is really insane. Honestly, for no save or anything, it's a very powerful trait. Now, the Swallowtail actually does not have a lot of gun mounts, and this is actually not a bad thing. There's a lot of good core bonuses that can really make use of this. So, that being the case, I actually think this might be one of its strengths, funny enough. Granted, you do have to use a core bonus with it, but it only has a flex mount and an aux mount. And honestly, for if you're just getting into the Swallowtail at the beginning, you might just end up using both of these as aux mounts, essentially. So it's not bad for sure, but these type of mounts aren't really good against enemies with medium or heavier armor, which makes your prophetic scanner all the more important if you want to use it yourself. So just something to keep in mind, this is not a very high power mech unless you invest in the core bonuses to do so. And finally, the core power, the Cloud Scout Taxim Swarms. And this is a very interesting one. I really like it, but I don't like the narrative behind it. So real quick, we're going to look at it here. I'm going to hide my camera. So once per round after you activate this, when an allied character within line of sight takes damage from another character in line of sight, you can roll a d6 and on a 4 or higher or a 50% chance. The ally gains resistance and then can teleport 3 spaces. But if you get 1 through 3, there's a glitch. Your ally doesn't get the resistance, but they can then teleport 6 spaces. And essentially what this is the Taxim inside the prophetic interjection is essentially like the Swallowtail is able to calculate parts of the battlefield, and so can recall an ally essentially at the last moment before they expect a strike to come up. Now, the reason why I don't like this particular one, narratively speaking, is one, teleporting, which is different than moving. So an ally who's currently already engaged with an enemy and the enemy swings on them, they can just not be there, not provoke Overwatch or anything like that. And that's very strange. I don't like the narrative idea because the idea is it's supposed to be this hyper advanced computer that can simulate all kinds of things and give your allies the ability to like avoid critical damage. But that's just not how it works. And I wish they had implemented a different kind of narrative around it. I think the ability is good, don't get me wrong. I think for a support mech, this ability is incredibly strong and I really, really do like it. I just don't like the narrative aspect behind it because I feel like it's really hard to justify, and I just don't know why they worded it as they did, which is my only real gripe. But that is the Swallowtail, which is a very interesting mech, I have to say. It's definitely not a damager, and it doesn't really do much else besides just being able to lock on. It can be a really good tech attacker, which is probably one of its better builds, honestly. But the prophetic scanners is what makes this mech honestly worth taking. But this isn't the only mech in this line, as we have a variant, and it's a pretty interesting one. Next, we have the Ranger variant, another just support frame, which is interesting because it can support its allies, I suppose, but it mostly wants to support itself. I do like the design. I like they just camoed it up, essentially covered it in grass and such. Really interesting, and I I like this mech, but I wish for variant mechs that they took a different twist a bit more aggressively than what they did with this one, or just do something different altogether. I wish this one was more honestly of a support artillery frame rather than just another support variant. But let's go ahead and take a look at its stats. So you can see here, the stats are almost identical, except its E defense is a little worse, which is, I mean, between the two would make sense, I suppose, but it's just a very interesting stat lineup that there's literally no major differences just besides the E defense. And the traits are similarly close to being similar, but there is a key difference. First, the main trait for this particular one is Scout Battlefield. I actually really like this trait because I think it's really fun. If you played any Warhammer or any other kind of war games, this one is gonna tickle you in a special way because essentially right before deployment and right before a combat starts, you get to tell the GM essentially two up to two anyway, you don't have to do two, up to two different like things in the environment that provide one of a certain kind of stat. So you can make a 2 by 2 zone that is soft cover and does not impede movement, which is very interesting that they mentioned does not impede movement. So I don't know if you can do something like put this on difficult terrain, preventing it from impeding movement because soft cover, as far as I know, doesn't impede movement normally. I don't know. You can also do a 2 by 2 zone of difficult terrain, which is a lot of fun. And you can create a size 1 piece of hardcover. Now, the piece of hardcover is not something I particularly think is going to be as used. The 2 by 2 zone of soft cover, I think, is going to be the most predominant use of this particular ability because soft cover is just really nice to have, in all honesty. Difficult terrain also I can see being used to cut off like a choke point or something along those lines. Now, an interesting point to make is these zones cannot be placed within 4 spaces of each other, but you can select the same option more than once. So you can have multiple zones of soft cover, multiple difficult uh difficult terrain zones. Some very interesting things. The hardcover actually might be really good in some areas where you can use it to kind of block off an area. You just can't put them together. But I don't know. Next, we have the invigorating scanners, and this one's very interesting, but I have to say is not as effective as the prophetic scanners. Invigorating scanners is once per round when the Swallowtail inflicts, it should say Raider variant, inflicts lock on an ally character in its center range and line of sight can move up to its speed as a reaction. That's really good in a lot of the comps that have a lot of melee frames in them. So I actually really like invigorating scanners, but I have to say it does not have the same impact as prophetic scanners of just shredding an enemy on lock on. So that being the case, I think this one's really good for a good initiative style of playstyle where you have a party member who's very much like ready to get into the combat right away. Invigorating scanners is a good way to put them right into the thick of it. And it's something I particularly like. Weathering is a strange trait name because what it does is you just ignore difficult terrain. But it doesn't infer anything like what is allowing the mech to avoid difficult terrain. Weathering just means this mech looks like it spends a lot of time out in the wilderness, so it's got to, I guess, ignore difficult terrain. I don't know, a very interesting choice for a trait name, but a very okay trait, honestly. I'm thinking about it now. The Swallowtails, either way, are not very like mobile mechs. They don't need to be super mobile. They want to stay on the outside of combat. This is really good if you're playing in an environment that has lots of difficult terrain. Jungle maps are obviously going to be your friend, so I guess that's where its major benefit is. But for the most part, most difficult terrain will be placed somewhere centralized on a battlefield typically. So, unless you're in a particular battlefield that has innate difficult terrain, I don't see this being useful, though you can use it in conjunction with your scout battlefield ability. So there are some interesting ways to use it. I think it's just an interesting choice for this style of mech. Similar but slightly worse mounts, we have a flex mount and a main mount. So now we can't do double ox loadout, which is very interesting. And as you can tell, there's a lot of things that makes this a little bit worse than the normal Swallowtail. And that's for a really good reason because down here in the Gaia inheritance, we have a really good passive ability for our core system. So for this one, when you end your turn in a zone that grants soft cover, you become invisible until you leave that cover. Take damage, attack, force a save, or take any other hostile action against another character. So the interesting thing about this is even though there's a lot of things that can remove this invisibility, it's not likely to happen unless, of course, you're taking damage, which invisibility kind of goes a long way to help, giving you a 50% chance of just ignoring a particular attack. So, and most of the other things you're not doing really when it's not your turn. Obviously, this means that similar to the other Swallowtail, you just don't want to take reactions. Anything that makes you do a reaction of any kind is just kind of bad on either of these mechs. But most of the time, you're just going to do your thing, and then you're going to end your turn in soft cover, which you can easily produce and can be produced in a lot of other very easy ways as well. And then you just become invisible. So, that being the case, I find this a very powerful passive that is going to make this mech very hard to deal with. Though, if enemies have a way of negating invisibility, it all goes out the window. But that's not very, very common. And again, artillery mechs are going to be a problem because they can just blast a whole area. So that's another thing you have to be really careful. But I do really like the passive. Now, the active effect is also very interesting. I'll actually hide my camera for this one. So, guerrilla warfare, you create 3 burst 1 patches of smoke in spaces within line of sight and range 5, which is very interesting because that's very close, actually. These patches grant soft cover to characters at least partially within them. They last for the rest of the scene. But the big one here is, additionally, for the rest of the scene, all characters within sensors gain the benefits of grounded, all allied characters. So, that being the case, the smoke, any kind of terrain you create, any kind of soft cover your allies can create, can allow them to get the benefit of grounded. That's really, really good and a very powerful kind of support style of play. Overall, I like both of these mechs. They both do somewhat offer support in different ways. While the normal Swallowtail mostly is just locking on, doing any kind of long range tech actions and the like. This mech also is locking on, but it creates a lot of beneficial difficult terrain. And it could still tech attack if it really wanted to, but this one is just a lot more of a mobile variant. As I kind of said before, I kind of wish that they had taken a bit of a different route with the Ranger variant. Maybe make it more aggressive Rambo-esque style. Maybe not Rambo, but like a real difficult terrain benefiting mech. But I do like how both of these mechs work. I don't think either of them are bad or anything like that. If it was a variant frame, since you're getting a license, I just wish that it provided a very different style of play. Even though most variants are at least within some line of the original, like when we're looking at the Blackbeard and the Impaki, they do just the same thing, but very, very differently. But the Ranger variant Swallowtail is not that different, in my opinion. So, starting here with the license itself, at rank 1, we have the Lotus projector. For 2 system points, you create a drone that allows you to create a burst 2 field somewhere out within sensor range. And any enemies in that burst, you now know their HP, evasion, E defense, and heat. And it does say of all characters within the affected area. So technically, this does work on your allies if your GM is playing a very calm, silent style of game where you don't know what's happening to your allies unless they tell you what's going on. So that can be very helpful. Now, hostile characters in the area cannot hide, and if they end their turn in the area, they cease to be hidden. Now, they can be hidden and go through the area, but they cannot use the hide action in the area. And if they end in the area, they become hidden. So, something that, you know, not a super big deal. Now, there's some other really interesting things here. First, another part is hostile characters cannot benefit from being invisible while in the affected area. And this drone is also invisible. And it's not limited, though it is a drone. So you get pretty much one until it breaks. This is a very interesting drone. I like it. The fact that it's invisible makes it much more annoying. And the enemy might not even know that they're being scanned, which is very cool. It doesn't state anywhere that enemies know of the area, and they need to be able to not only detect the drone, but be able to discern what kind of drone it is. So this is actually one of the most efficient scouting drones in the game. It has a lot of good out of combat utility and a lot of really good in combat utility as well. So overall, a very big thumbs up for me. This is a really cool drone. Next up is Marker Light, probably one of the best tech actions in the game if used correctly. So for 2 system points, you get a full tech action that when you use it and you are successful, the enemy takes 2 heat and gains lock on, and they can't benefit from any soft cover until the lock on is cleared. Additionally, and this is the part that really makes it super powerful, whenever an ally declares, or whenever an ally hits the target, you can declare as a reaction that they've hit a weak spot, and if it wasn't already, the attack becomes a critical. This is one of the very few ways you can force criticals in the game, and there's so many really good weapons that do some very nasty things on critical. So you get a full tech action that does 2 heat, locks on, and guarantees a critical when an ally hits. That's really good. That's very insane, honestly. The Marker Light is a very powerful system, but you will be spending your entire turn unless you overcharge doing just this. Great for a good support build, really good for any support build, really. But you do probably want a really decent sensor range if you want to make the most use of it. So I wouldn't put this on any mech that has less than the 10 sensors. At rank 2, we have the Oracle LMG-I or -1. Not quite sure. I think it's -I. And this is one of my favorite guns in the game, honestly, because it's so good. It's a range 15 gun. Now, it's a light gun. It's auxiliary rifle. So it does do only a D3 damage, but it's accurate, and more impressively, it's arcing as well. I don't think any other rifle in the game that has arcing in addition. And arcing for the purpose of this weapon purely is just so you can shoot over cover at your enemies. Now, they still get the benefits of cover, but if they're behind a wall or something that is preventing you from hitting them, as long as there's no roof, you can definitely shoot them. That is something that's really, really cool. And what's really cool with the Swallowtail, not the Ranger variant, which is very sad. The Swallowtail can equip essentially 4 of these, 2 mounts with 2 of these weapons, so that if it ever wants to, it can full barrage with a bunch of shots that are highly accurate, can arc over cover. And I mean, like, if you're playing a crack shot build, especially, this works insanely well with it. I really love the Oracle LMG. Its biggest weakness is only that it does only a D3 damage, but there are so many ways you can add bonus damage to something like this, which makes it a lot easier to use as a primary damaging weapon. So overall, insanely really good uh, second rank pickup when you're already getting 2 pretty decent frames in addition. Also here at rank 2, we have retractable profile, a 1-point system, which honestly is pretty cool. And I like what the system does, but it's very particular, and I think it's more useful out of combat than it is in combat. Essentially what it does is, as a protocol, you can activate this, and your mech shrinks down, becoming as minimal as possible. Any rolls to locate you are at a +1 difficulty while you're hidden. Range and tech attacks against you are at a +1 difficulty. You become slowed and can't make attacks of any kind, which is pretty major. Slow especially means you can only use your mech's innate movement to move and nothing else. And not being able to attack, well, I mean, speaks for itself. Though you may take other actions, including hide, activate, and so on. It does not say that you can't do things like bolster, lock on, all that kind of stuff, as long as it's not an attack. So no tech attacks either, which is a little unfortunate, but it makes sense. You're pulling in your antennas, you're doing a bunch of other things. There's a lot of good ways that this can be used, and it can make your mech much more difficult to hit. And it's really good for stealthy mechs. If you're willing to take a turn not attacking and not doing a lot of things, This can work on a lot of different builds, especially within Smith Shimano. There's a lot of mechs that are very assassin-y, like style of get in and attack the most vulnerable enemies. So retractable profile I can see being used in a lot of different builds. You can even remove this as a quick action. So if you start your turn this way, you can do whatever and then quick action pop out. Then you can do a thing. Though I don't know why you would do that because hide is an action, and I guess you could overcharge to do it. I don't know. This is a particular system really good for people who are patient and can capitalize on opportunity, and not good for a very Rambo, like into the thick of it style of gameplay. And this also is just relevant to your campaign as well. You might not get the ability to use retractable profile to its most in your game. So it's you gotta take this one on a case by case basis. But it's only one system point, so honestly, it's not that bad. All right, we're getting here to the end. Before we hit the third rank license stuff, as always, if you're enjoying this kind of content, please leave a like. This increases the chance of other people to find the content, which is really important on YouTube, especially in the TTRPG field. And in addition, if you want to see more of this, I would recommend subscribing to the channel, which increases your chances, or even just going to our Discord, which, is linked in the description below. As from the Discord, anytime we go live, you will get, or anytime a video goes live or we go live for our weekly podcast, you will get a notification. But let's go ahead and get to the third rank with the Athena class NHP. So the Athena NHP is very interesting and one I have some mixed feelings on. It's a 3-point system, as most NHPs tend to be, as they all are really good. And what it does is insane, because within a range 50, you create a blast 3 area, which is a very big area, I have to add. And you get pretty much all information of that area. You get full visibility of the area, though this doesn't count as line of sight. You know all the statistics, weapons, systems of characters within the affected area. Hostile characters within the affected area cannot hide or become invisible, and hostile characters that end their turn in the area receive lock on and cease to be invisible or hidden. This will last for the scene or until you change it as a quick action, or it can last 30 minutes in narrative play as well. And the thing is, it's not limited, and this is not a once per scene kind of thing. This is just whenever you want to spend a quick action to essentially know everything in an area. Out of combat, this is insane. 50 range is a massive distance. Real scale, I think 50 is like, it's like a quarter mile range. It's a really far distance. Yeah, I think it's about a quarter mile range. And the various aspects here allow you to gain a lot of insight on an area to prevent enemies from hiding out. There's also just no enemies can really understand. Maybe because they can't become invisible, they might realize something's up, but otherwise, there's nothing that gives the simulacrum away, which is very good, honestly. And not only that, but any enemies that end their turn in the area get lock on might also be another indicator as something's going on, but that's a good way to get lock on a lot of enemies. And if enemies do figure out what's going on, they have to try to move out of the area. Now, a blast 3 area is not the worst. It's a lot when you consider total area, but for movement, most mechs can just move out of that range pretty simple. The thing that makes this really good though is enemies that are in cover, are defending a certain point, they're just gonna have to sit and get lock on every round, because otherwise they have to give up the point to get out of their range. And you can move this as just a quick action. So this is a very good NHP, though it's purely support. It doesn't do anything offensive really. And the lock on is only good after the enemies end their turn there. So when you use this, you're not getting any lock ons like right away. I like the Athena, but I think it's a very particular niche NHP that, while it does do some really interesting things, I don't feel like any of those things push towards beating a battle necessarily any better than any other NHP, and honestly a little worse than other NHPs. Though out of combat, I think this one is unparalleled. The amount of information gathering you can do with just this one NHP alone is insane, and in the right hands can turn any battle. But in combat, that's a different kind of story. So overall, I think this is a top tier NHP, but niche, which, is going to be either really good for you or something you're just not going to be interested in. That's just how it goes. And last up, we have the LBOC Cloaking Field. Now, this is a super expensive system of 4 system points. And honestly, this always tends to be the thing. The last thing in any rank 3 license always seems to disappoint me to some degree. This one's not the worst, but it's not the best either. Because essentially, as a quick action, you activate this and you create a burst 2 area where you and all allies in the area become invisible as long as they remain within the area. Now, the effect lasts until the end of your next turn or until you're stunned, take damage, or deactivate it as a quick action. So, another thing that just seems to be very particular to the Swallowtail is just being vulnerable to artillery fire. Anything long range, big boom is something that you're going to have to be super aware of. And in addition to that, I shouldn't say in addition to that, though, despite that, this actually does not prevent anyone from becoming visible again. There we go. Unless this invisibility tends to be better than most other invisibilities because it's not deactivated by the standard methods. Attacking or doing whatever does not prevent the invisibility from continuing to activate. So as long as you don't become stunned or take damage or whatever, you'll remain invisible even after attacking, which is really powerful. And at a 2 heat cost is not too terrible. This is really good in, I think, some styles of play, and this is one of the better invisibilities, but I do feel like there's other invisibilities that, while not being as good, are cheaper and easier to use than this one. So that being the case, it's kind of a meh for me. I think it's really cool. A burst 2 area allows you to run with your other size 1, maybe a size 2 ally, but this is a burst around you. And not only that, but you become slowed in addition to this. I think that this one is very interesting, has some very interesting uses. But again, it kind of like the Athena, it does not lead to beating a combat encounter. It more just is something that can aid you, maybe. But out of combat, this is very powerful, has all kinds of different uses. And even in combat, it's not that bad. I mean, just being invisible until you take damage is a very powerful effect. But if you want to be invisible, I feel like there's just other mechs that are better at it. Regardless, if you're cloaking your artillery buddy in the backline, I feel like this is a very powerful effect. And yeah, that's going to be it for me. The Swallowtail is a very good, interesting mech line. Very support based, does not have a lot of good damage, but I do really love the Oracle LMG. I think the first rank is also really good for anyone who wants to add some really good support capabilities, especially with the marker light. If I was to change anything about this license, I would throw in or swap out maybe even the cloaking field with some kind of quick hack or something, a quick tech or invade or something to make use of the mech's innate tech attack bonus, because I feel like that's one of its stronger suits, and I feel like that's something that plays more into the play style than the invisibility necessarily leans to. And I also, another part of the invisibility, the cloaking field I find harder to take with the Swallowtail specifically, is the Swallowtail already has a way of becoming invisible as long as they don't move. And the cloaking field is only just an option if they need to use it while moving. So it's something that you would take very situationally, because it just might not always benefit your mech if you're playing a Swallowtail. And even more so for the Ranger variant, as they get invisibility, I would say, much more easily than just the standard version of the Swallowtail. So I'm not sure, but I do like it as a pickup that you can take to other licenses. I think there's some really cool things you can add it to other licenses. And even though you do become slowed, there's a lot of really, really fast mechs out there that can get where they need to go even while slowed. So I like this frame. I like both the frames. I like this style of gameplay. I think though that this is not a mech that you can really live off of the license itself, and you need to pick up things from other licenses in order to make the Swallowtail really shine, which is a little sad, but also it promotes creativity, which is something that I enjoy. But anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Hopefully this all helped you all out, and hopefully this information was useful to you. Like I said, I'll try to get to more of these Lancer videos as often as I can. And as always, good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.